Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for tomorrow's two-game NFL slate. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of tomorrow's exposure. With first off, a look at the Draftkings side, what I'm doing for the two-game slate, and then afterwards, a look through the Underdog and Prize Picks boards for a few props that I've already entered myself that you might want to consider adding to a few slips of your own. There's a lot to go through here. Let's go ahead and hop right on in. But first off, a look at the DFS side. It's my birthday today, so I gotta keep this one a little quick. Got some plans to get to this afternoon, but didn't want to leave you guys hanging from a preview perspective. So definitely going to go through everything to expect for tomorrow. So the first thing to touch on before we go position by position is going to be your lineup construction for a two-game slate. It has to be a little bit of a combination of what you do out there for a main slate and then the kind of thinking that you're using out there for Showdown. The reason I say that is you have the same exact lineup construction when it comes to the main slate. I'm talking 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, you got the defense, all of that sort of stuff. But when you only have the 2-game sample size, you've got to think about correlation, game scripting, kind of like you would out there for a Showdown slate. So that is the same as we talked about the entire year. If you've been here the entire year, you've heard me talk about that before, but that is going to be the case out there for Saturday. And at this quarterback position, what that means is you want to be correlating with a wide receiver or a tight end. So pretty much no matter which quarterback you go with, maybe the one that this would apply to the least would be Lamar Jackson, just because he does have a little bit of rushing upside, but especially guys like Mahomes, Stroud, and Wilson, you should be pairing up with at least 2 pass catching options out there from either team, if not to the 3-4 range on a 2-game slate. Now Lamar, because of that rushing upside, maybe you're only getting to 1-2 pass catchers, but even somebody like Lamar, you should be looking for that correlation as well. The other thing I'll point out here is that Lamar is by far your highest owned quarterback, which would make sense with how soft the pricing is. A lot of times an $8,200 price tag would make Lamar Jackson a little bit more competitively owned, but because the pricing across the board, whether it's running back, wide receiver that will go through, you're going to have plenty of options to save some salary. You don't really have to worry about it all that much. So that's why he's 42%, but outside of Lamar, you've got about 25% on Mahomes, which is pretty reasonable. And if you go down to a CJ Stroud or Russell Wilson, you're looking at sub 20% ownership. So in large field GPPs, it is clear who you can use to go out there and get different to the field, and it's also clear who's going to be the chalk at that position as well. Moving on to running back, you're going to want to correlate this with your quarterback as well. And what I mean by that is you probably don't want to play a running back against your quarterback stack unless you're hoping for your quarterback to be a buyback. The main reason for that is if your quarterback's going out there and having a field day, you don't want the team that's playing from behind against that said quarterback. But of course, if you're assuming that the quarterback is playing from behind, you could look at the other side of that game script. But these are the sort of things that you want to be thinking through with your lineup. And what's worth noting is that the matchups out there for tomorrow do favor the rushing attack against the Steelers. So somebody like Derrick Henry is popping in my projections because of that. And then also against Kansas City, you've got Joe Mixon with a pretty solid matchup there. Kansas City is pretty stout on both sides of the ball, but especially with their secondary and their passing defense. So guys like a Mixon would see a benefit because of that. The Steelers front seven, a lot more susceptible against the run than what they have against the secondary in the pass. So I think that these two are going to be extremely popular out there for tomorrow, but I think it is well warranted with the matchups in play. Outside of that, the ownership drops off rather quickly. So it goes from about 50% on those top 2 really good matchup players down to about 30% on your next 3 running backs. That would be a Pacheco, a Warren, and a Najee Harris that are all grouped there together. And a thing worth noting is that Jaylen Warren, who is the clear number 2 running back for the Steelers, is about the same ownership as Najee Harris, which I can tell you as a Steeler fan is not an efficient level of ownership, as Najee Harris is getting exponentially more snaps than what you have there with Warren. It is worth noting, though, that if the Steelers are playing from way behind, that Warren is the more receiving back, would play a few more snaps in that kind of game script. But if you're expecting the Steelers to keep this competitive, the Steelers-Ravens games, by the way, are almost always like 3 to maybe 7-point games, then Najee Harris is the running back that you want. So I think depending on the kind of game script that you're going with, maybe if you're playing a Lamar Jackson stack, you're looking to somebody like a Jaylen Warren instead, as Lamar Jackson playing from ahead would lead to more usage out there for Warren, and vice versa, right? If you're fading that Ravens offense, maybe it's because the Steelers go out there, control the time of possession, and you'd probably be looking for somebody like Najee Harris in that kind of lineup. outside of that mid-tier range, it drops off even more so with the ownership after those three. You've got guys like Kareem Hunt, who will still be playing at about 14% and about 15% ownership on a Justice Hill. And kind of like Jaylen Warren is the receiving back for the Steelers, Justice Hill is the receiving back out there for Baltimore. Now, there are a few reports that he missed practice this week due to some personal reasons, so we're going to want to make sure that he's actually playing out there on Saturday. So not an injury concern that we have there with Justice Hill, but I think something going on with his personal life that could shake things up. We also got Cordell Patterson, Dare Ogunbowale down there for the Texans at $4,000. These would be your pure GPP flyers. This would be the kind of play that you're using in the large field contest to try and get different. You're not using these sort of players over there in single entries cash or anything like that, as they are far too risky down there at $4,000. For a showdown slate, they'd probably be between $200 and $1,000. Instead, they're a whole $4,000 on this sort of slate. So just not as much upside as what we'd have in a showdown format. At wide receiver, we've got a lot of ownership towards the top, just like every other position. The reasoning for that, of course, is how soft the pricing is. And just to show you how much salary that you're going to have to work with, you've got Nico Collins, who's $8,100. Definitely expensive there, but your next price down is $5,900. So it drops off an absolute cliff when it comes to the price tag. So wide receiver is one of the positions that you're going to have an easy time saving salary with. And then outside of Kelsey at tight end, you're also going to have pretty much infinite salary over there at tight end. So that's why somebody like Lamar can continue to get that ownership. It's why these two expensive running backs are still getting the attention as well. Not so much a surprise when you look at it that way. Going over here to the wide receiver position, though, I've got a few other guys that I want to point out. So the main ones being some of these lower owned wide receivers here in the mid tier. So we've got Calvin Austin III going against a shaky secondary of the Ravens. You've got guys like Tank Dell that are a little bit lower owned. I know he's not the wide receiver one out there for CJ Stroud, but should be playing from behind as underdogs against Kansas City. These are your perfect buybacks. If you're going to go with a relatively popular Lamar Jackson stack, you could use Jaylen Warren as buyback. I think Calvin Austin would be a great buyback for the Steelers. You're going with a Patty Mahomes stack over there for the Chiefs. A Tank Dell. You could look at Dalton Schultz at tight end for a potential buyback. That's where I think you can get a little bit of leverage to the field. You're not taking a 50% owned Nico Collins, for example. You're not taking a 40% owned running back to try and get that leverage. You're more in that like 20 to 30% range, where if you're playing them in 50, 60% of your lineups, that's 2x leverage to the field right there. So those are the guys that I prefer. You know, you're going to have to mix in some of these chalky guys, like those two running backs, maybe a Nico Collins there at $8,100, but where I think you should spend more of your time, where you're going to win and lose your contests tomorrow, are going to be those mid-tier players. And it's not like you can use all of them, right? I know I mentioned Dell, Calvin Austin. Those are guys that I'm for sure going to be playing myself. There are guys like DeAndre Hopkins that I really like too. So the unfortunate aspects, the part that we maybe won't touch on as much here, are the guys that I'm going to have to take out of my player pool. So guys, just make sure that you're getting leverage in your pool. You can't use everyone out there in your lineups. And somebody like Xavier Worthy or Rashad Bateman down here at $4,900 might be a few of those casualties that don't go ahead and make it into lineups. A Mike Williams, I want to point him out as a potential option for tomorrow. Also a Justin Watson, a downfield threat that is definitely a little bit of a risky play, but could get there in a few circumstances. That's probably where I would go ahead and cut off my player pool. The last guy I'll mention would be a Hollywood Brown out there for Kansas City. He is the minimum price tag. I also don't think a lot of people will be talking about him out there for tomorrow, but there's a really good chance that he's going to be activated out there for Saturday and could be playing for the first time in a long time this year. So, I would expect him to be limited. He's probably not going to play his full snap share, his first game back from devastating injury, but he is a world-class talent down there at just $3,000 and is essentially going to be unowned out there in GPP. So, of course, guys, over here on the right, my player pool is completely blacked out right now. For all of that, make sure to check out the Patreon page, link in the description of the video to go out there and join the Patreon page. But when we get that news about Hollywood Brown, the main thing I'm going to focus on, projection is going to be a little bit low, probably like a 4 or 5 point projection because of the limited snap rate. What I'm a lot more worried about is going to be that projected ownership tab, because if he can go out there, give us a big play, maybe it's a big play touchdown in that limited snap share. If we're getting him at sub 5, maybe sub 10% ownership, I'm going to be a buyer down there at $3,000. Let's go to tight end real quickly. Again, I got to keep this one a little bit shorter as I've got some birthday plans today. But over here at the tight end position, we've got a lot of just decent plays, like Pat Freiermuth getting attention, but I really do like him out there for tomorrow. Kelsey's $5,600. I mean, if you can afford him, go out there and play him. But these other guys, the guys that are a little bit lower owned, like I think they should be lower owned. Like for example, Mark Andrews likely that are splitting time, both about 15 to 25%. Dalton Schultz at about 20%. He might be my favorite play on the slate actually at tight end, which is pretty sad because he's not a sexy play by any means. They're just 8.5 point projection, but as underdogs against Kansas City, they've been a pretty soft defense against tight ends this year. There's just no one else to really go out there and flag plant behind. So it's going to be quite a bit of Dalton Schultz for me out there in my builds, whether I'm stacking, even just as like a 1 or 2 off out there from the other game that I'm not stacking. I'm going to have quite a bit of exposure to a Dalton Schultz there. If you're looking for leverage, a Noah Gray, a Darnell Washington are probably my favorite 2 options out there for that kind of leverage. Noah Gray, number 2 tight end out there for Kansas City. Darnell Washington, he's more of a blocking tight end out there for Pittsburgh, but as he's such a good blocker, I mean, he plays 50, 60% of snaps out there for the Steelers now. He's got a lot of real red zone upside. So you got guys like Pruitt, Hayward, they're like the 3-4 tight ends out there for the Steelers. Irv Smith Jr. hardly even playing out there this year. These are the kind of GPP flyers that you have, but a Gray, a Washington, I think are a little bit more live out there for the single entries in cash than most people would expect for tomorrow. And then lastly, at defense, the main thing I want to point out to here is the ownership on the Chiefs defense is abnormally high. I've got them at about 29.3% ownership. I've also got the Texans defense getting a little bit of steam as well. Surprisingly, the Ravens defense only 24%, and the Steelers defense, which sure, tough matchup. Baltimore has the MVP, second place guy behind Josh Allen this year over there with Lamar Jackson, is only 19.2% owned though. So if you can stomach the tough matchup, the Steelers have seemingly been Lamar Jackson's kryptonite over the years. Could be a little spot to get some leverage on tomorrow. And now for the prop side of things, where I've got 2 props I've already entered. You guys might want to keep an eye on yourself. And the best place to play these right now is undoubtedly over here on Underdog, where you can get over a 3.6x payout. So we're going to start with this Pat Freiermuth over on receptions, which is about even money on a lot of the major sports books. It opened minus 130, even minus 135 for the under on a few spots. But as the lines have matured a little bit, they've started to get closer to even money. And frankly, by the time we get to lock tomorrow, I think he could be juiced heavily towards the over. Main reason for that being George Pickens being rolled out, and this is already a line that he was pretty much spot on with for the entire year, averaging 3.4 receptions per game. So with George Pickens out, that's going to open up a little bit of extra usage out there for Freiermuth, but you also have a secondary and passing defense in general out there for Baltimore that has left a lot to be desired this year. They've been very susceptible to opposing passing attacks, and in fact ranked bottom 5, bottom 10 in pretty much every single category that you can think of. Against tight ends, they've been about middle of the pack at defending them and letting up just under 6 receptions per game. And given that Freiermuth is by far the best receiving tight end that the Steelers have, I mean, you're going to have a few other guys mix in like Washington, mentioned guys like Hayward and Pruitt before. You've got Freiermuth playing 60-70% of the snaps against a spot that has been relatively soft. So you give him the soft matchup, you give him a little bit of extra usage with George Pickens rolled out, and then on this spot on Underdog, we're getting a 1.11x multiplier on top of that. You could see why I went out there and mixed it in. And the little just cherry on top too could be the game script, which would favor the Steelers passing attack, as they are about touchdown underdogs against the Baltimore Ravens. So all that being said, I think you're going to see some line movement towards the over. And if so, this would be a really good spot to lock in now. The next one we got is a Patrick Mahomes over on passing touchdowns, who faces the Texans defense, who they've been really, really good against the run, and top 5 in pretty much every running metric. They've been about middle of the road against opposing passing quarterbacks in the real big red flag. And if you look at the just passing defenses in the NFL, they let up the Texans, that is, the most passing touchdowns of any team in the NFL at 1.93 per game. You're getting Patrick Mahomes, who is one of the elite quarterbacks in the NFL, going against the softest matchup that we have in all the NFL. Now, there have been a few outliers that have really made the Texans defense look bad, but with the Chiefs as favorites, obviously he's a little bit banged up this week. He had that ankle injury that everyone was worried about, but all the reports from practice are that he's moving around. He looks like the normal Patrick Mahomes. He's making the throws on the run like we're used to seeing. So I don't know if we have to be all that worried about it, as we tend to get more and more of these reports reports closer to lock, I think this is also going to juice closer to even money, if not potentially towards the over by the time that we get to lock tomorrow. So just like the Freiermuth prop, we're getting a 1.11x multiplier on that spot. Hence, by this pays 3.69x out there for the multiplier. And on a site like FanDuel, which has already put Mahomes, I believe, was minus 120 for the under, it was minus 105 for the over. So starting to just get really close to the even money like we're looking for. At even money and then potentially going over, you can see why I'd want to take both of these spots. So obviously the solid payout there, just under a 4x payout overall on two props that I would mix in. And the reason why I said to go ahead, take this on Underdog as opposed to Prize Picks is you're getting the multiplier, and there is a multiplier on Mahomes over on that side, but not on the Freiermuth prop. So that's why I say to enter it over here. Always be line shopping, making sure that you're getting the best lines available for all the props, all the slips I end up entering myself, whether it's for the Saturday slate or our Sunday main slate, which of course we'll have a video dropping on tomorrow over here on the channel. Make sure to join my Patreon page for all of that. On there, I post all the slips that I'm getting to, so whether it's on Underdog, Prize Picks, or on the books there on Hard Rock Bet, all of that sort of stuff, make sure to join for all of that exposure. That's all I've got for the Saturday preview. Go ahead, smash that like button before you hop on out of here, and go ahead and comment down below who you've got as the top scorer on tomorrow's slate. If you can give me the top scorer and their score within 2 Draftkings points, you will win a free month access to my Patreon page. So go ahead, give me your best guess down below, and best of luck with all of your exposure for Saturday, whether it's for DFS over there with your lineups or on the prop side of things with your Underdog and Prize Picks exposure. Hopefully you guys kill it and can find your name towards the top of some of those leaderboards. But that's all I've got for all the preview here on Saturday. Best of luck, as I mentioned, and let's get it out there for tomorrow.